So, should we do this?
Here we are.
Yes, here we are. We have roughly an hour to do this. Okay. So, welcome to the second spring session, recording session of the Café con Paulo Freire podcast. We've been doing this for a couple of years now, me and Azril in different formats. We started the podcast format last autumn. And my name is Daniel. I work with outreach and education at CEMUS. Great to have you here, Dougald. Long time friend now, we can say, of CEMUS. You've been part of many different courses, but also the Climate Existence Conference in different ways and different formats. You can introduce yourself a bit more. And we're also here in CEMUS Library, which is fun. The door is working. The people are here studying, discussing. So this is a nice way to do a podcast as well. We're not in a secret room. It's an open space. And hello also to the people online. And this is recorded video and audio, like usual. Yeah. And CEMUS also is the Center for Environment and Development Studies at Uppsala University. And everything expressed here is not Uppsala University or CEMUS in an official sense. But we know that. Okay. And Dougald, maybe best you introduce yourself. You have a long bio online, but maybe there's a couple of things you want to say and add to what I said.
Well, as you say, CEMUS, where we're meeting, is a place that I have a great sense of friendship with. It's the corner of academia that I feel most at home in. I'm a writer, a thinker, and I've been at least partially responsible for creating a number of organizations, including the Dark Mountain Project and including a school called Home. But I do most of my work independently or in small, intimate, domestic-scaled, convivial institutions that are small enough that we can all sit around a table and share a meal together. And so often in universities I feel a bit like a fish out of water, but CEMUS has always felt to me like it sits on the boundary between the institutional world of universities and the convivial world in which I swim and think and write and talk and laugh and share food. And so it's a place where I feel at home. I suppose the other thing to say about my work is last year I came out with a book called At Work in the Ruins, Finding Our Place in the Time of Science, Climate Change, Pandemics and all the other emergencies. And among many other things, I write a little bit in there about some of the time I spent with Gustavo Esteva and the influence that he had on my work. So it's great to be here with somebody else who knew Gustavo and to be in conversation and honouring his memory today.
Great. And the title also, This is a Time of Barbarism, is from a recent video. He passed away 2 years ago, I think, but it was from 2000 or 2001. So that's also online, and it's also on the post that we made about the event. If you want to see Gustavo and have him speak as part of that event as well. Okay, Azril, you want to briefly introduce yourself as well?
Briefly is a big thing to say when you are 82 going to 83. So
shorter than short.
So 82 seconds. I can identify fully with what you express about CEMUS and a place to be oneself and still contribute to the little drop in the ocean we can contribute. My background is first as agricultural engineer. I was part of the Peruvian student movement. A bit like Gustavo, I worked in public universities. I was advisor to the Minister of Agriculture in agrarian reform. was a transformative moment in Peruvian political history. And then I moved, following my interests, different disciplines. So sociology, let's say, at Uppsala University. And now I'm continuing with something in Spain along the lines of agroecology and sustainable development. I've been an activist throughout my life, and I've been privileged to be able to have one foot in these spaces, academic spaces, in the interstices sometimes, like Samos, sometimes more in the center. I've been chairman of the Department of Anthropology and Sociology in Mexico and so on. I've been part of the World Social Forum. I'm part of GTA that Gustavo created, and in contact with Ashish Kothari, and Samos then is beginning kind of together working there. I write poetry and publish some poetry, and we edited a book here at Samos with Emerald Publishers on transformative research and higher education. And it sold so well, even though it was bloody expensive, that they are going to launch the paperback edition next week. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
That's short, good.
Short and sweet.
And also poetry is the theme for next session we have, March 21st, World Poetry Day. And that's a poetry circle, so we don't have like a star poet coming in. It's everybody sharing their own or somebody else's poetry in a circle. So that will be fun in a couple of weeks. Okay, we should dive into Gustavo Esteva and his life, what we can learn from him. And we put this concept of the politics of hope in there as well in the title. But there's many ways, many different paths we can take with this. Who feels like starting? Because I'm thinking also how you came across Gustavo Esteva's work. You met him, but also the impact and influence on your thinking and the work that you do. Maybe you can start, Dougald, and then we can switch over to you, Azril.
I remember very clearly meeting Gustavo for the first time. It was December 2007. I had found out 2 weeks earlier that there was a gathering happening in Cuernavaca, Mexico, to mark the 5th anniversary of the death of Ivan Illich. And I had never met Illich, but his work had been very important to me. I borrowed some money from my parents, booked a flight, showed up in Cuernavaca, didn't speak Spanish, didn't know anyone else who was there. And this gang of Illich's surviving friends and collaborators have adopted me out of their sheer curiosity about this young English guy who had made this journey to come and join them. And Gustavo was such a powerful presence within that circle. Obviously, we were on his home ground in Mexico. I remember these bright eyes and the nose and the sheer energy of the man. And then a couple of years later, so then I was there for a week and I got to spend some time with him then. A couple of years later, he was coming to London and I saw him speak at a place called The Hub in Islington that was a sort of centre for social entrepreneurs and innovators in London. And I saw him completely polarize this room full of people, many of whom I knew, because his message was so outrageous to some of them that they got really angry. Because he was very much, cut from the same cloth as Illich. Illich gave this famous speech called "To Hell with Good Intentions," where he told this kind of white North American audience, don't come to Mexico to help. If you have to go somewhere and help, have the decency to do it in inner city Chicago, where when people tell you to fuck off, you'll understand. And so Gustavo was kind of coming with the same message from the global South to this community of well-meaning, mostly pretty privileged people in London. And there were a few of us who were already very in tune with what he was talking about, but there were a lot of other people for whom this was outrageous. So we laughed quite a bit together at that session. And then I had the chance to go a couple of times in the years that followed and spend some time and record some conversations with him at his home in the hills outside of Cuernavaca. And so, I didn't know him as well as lots of people did, but he had a lasting impact on me, partly because he was a living connection to two of the people whose work had been absolutely formative for me. On the one hand, Ivan Illich, and on the other hand, John Berger. And he was friends with both of them. But also Gustavo's own thinking and his stories, the directions in which he took the work where he was in conversation with Illich and with Berger were very important to me. And that framing that he and Madhu Suryaprakash offered in the 90s, they wrote a book called Grassroots Postmodernism. I've come back to that again and again. And when John Berger died, I wrote about him and I said, he was the great European representative of grassroots postmodernism, of a postmodernism that doesn't emanate from seminar rooms in Paris or London or Chicago, but that was formed out of a kind of a retreat from the failure of the hopes of 1968 that led into the hills and into dialogue with peasant and indigenous cultures, and therefore into a rethinking of the legacies of Marxism without the kind of industrial narrative of progress that had been integral to mainline Marxist thought. And so, Gustavo, in his connections to Illich and Berger and also to the Zapatistas, and in the framing that he and Madhu offered of grassroots postmodernism, for me helped to crystallize a map on which I can locate a lot of the thinking, a lot of the work that has mattered most to me and helped me find my bearings in the strange times that we're in. So that's a bit of how I met him and what some of the things that he meant to me.
Mm. Yeah, and it should be said also before I let you in, Azril, that even Illich and I think also Gustavo Esteva and a couple of other, mostly men, were important or formative for SEMAS also. When SEMAS started, Wolfgang Sachs was part of that.
Yes.
And the kind of systems critique, the critique of development, the critique of doing things like you're expected to do. So that was also formative in how SEMAS also did not only become a project about sustainability in a very shallow way, but also it was a critique of a lot of things on a lot of different levels. So, yes. Azril, how did you come across Gustavo Esteva and where did you meet him? And how
Mexico.
In
Mexico. I moved from Peru to Mexico in 81, and we met personally in Mexico City 85 after a big earthquake that it would have lasted seconds or one more minute would have been more devastating. And at that time he was already working with the notion of networks, so kind of horizontal paradigm that then is part of his scope. And the GTA that he was the creator, I think, with key people like Ashish Kothari, who we are in contact with, has this idea of weaving. So, so we just clicked. Like him, I had been part of the reproduction of the developmentalist paradigm. I had taught in Mexico at the postgraduate school theories of development. I have done that for now a more critical position at the Catholic University in Lima, but then including things like Swadeshi, Gandhian approach to maldevelopment. Gandhi coined the term maldevelopment, and then had a view that is Swadeshi. So, and it was clearly Chinese to graduate students in the Catholic University. It's an elite university run by the Jesuits. And Esteva had, Gustavo, the influence from the Jesuits, from the progressive side, because you have a range in the Jesuits. The progressive Jesuits, Ivan Illich, that you mentioned, he was a monsignor, almost a bishop. And then the Vatican didn't stomach him, and he didn't stomach. And it was interesting because his background is a Jewish background, Yugoslavian. Then he's monsignor, and then and something else that we shared in the 80s, 70s, 80s. He worked closely with Luis Echevarria. It's sexenio, it's called 6 years. And Echevarria was, even in this center for the studies of the third world, was a place of meeting. So Gustavo was in that space, Abdel Malek from Egypt, Hugo Semmelmann, Chilean Marxist. So we shared this kind of progressive think tank that was, in a way, not Marxist, but Marxian or post-Marxist. He did take from Marx his work on alienation, which is, I think, very important today. Marx's work on alienation was not published in the Soviet Union until after Stalin died, because it was an invitation to look critically at yourself. How do you become estranged from yourself? And then you can be instrumental in reproducing oppression. So we met physically last time, 2010, in Oaxaca. We had a small international group that were going to control or guarantee that elections were not fraud. The governor was called as the alchemist he was an international consultant on political alchemy, how to manage elections. So Gustavo, out of kindness or friendship, came to the group and gave us, explained the situation then, and against what he and many people expected, the governor lost the election for X reasons. Then we met with somebody from this network I was telling you, Universidad de Compromiso Social in Sevilla, with Vicente Manzano Arrondo, psychologist. We edited the book for Spanish-speaking teachers, became a little book, you could say, about the absurd university and the hope of the bridge between universities and social movements. And Gustavo wrote a book about his experience with the Universidad de la Vida.
Yeah.
So that was it. And then last time we met was GTA, maybe 2 years ago. And I guess I was hoping to meet him again there. And then just to complete this kind of journey, the book Grassroots Postmodernism was quite inspired by the Zapatistas, I would say, and the process is still going on. And in that tradition, maybe we should meet in the future John Holloway, that Dougald knows. You haven't met, but you know his work. And I lectured for his students last year in Puebla. And I think by indirectly now working together with GTA, we're part of this weaving process. As GTA, it's not just about problematizing the world, but looking for examples of what is working today as an alternative vision. Mm-hmm. Like Yes Magazine does the same. They're documenting, this works. So instead of inviting collective hopelessness, it's showing that it is possible, and then what are the conditions, what are the obstacles, in that sense, hope.
Yeah. And also, I mean, and that's very much what the kind of context here at CMS, it sounds kind of dark to say, like we're fostering individual and collective hopelessness, but I think also, because of what I'm thinking in this is the relevance of his work and others you mentioned in this today, because for me, but I think also in the CMS, larger CMS context, it feels like a lot of the anchoring points we had, what kind of kept us in an interesting place, and we kind of knew a direction or different directions. We feel like it's more now a ship floating freely in a storm, where different things that I know is relevant, but I can't really place it in a relevant context. For example, like when we talk about the critique of development or critique of Western industrial societies, or the critique of like people wanting to come to help, or the critique of research and universities that was also touched upon. How do we make sense of all of this?
So, I mean, one of the perils of the university environment is that it can easily end up being a place where critique is treated as an end in itself rather than an unfinished process. And part of the strength of what Gustavo brought from the fact that he was working, as he used to say, as a deprofessionalized intellectual, was an embedding in places where no one is going to pat you on the back for simply offering critique. That you're actually part of. One of his texts that I know has been important to a lot of people from the 1980s was called Regenerating People's Space. And that act of regenerating, and again, the grassroots postmodernism wasn't satisfied with deconstruction, which became the kind of the center of gravity of the kind of academic Parisian Western postmodernism, partly because it was a critique of modernity coming from movements and communities on the receiving end of processes of modernization, and therefore having to be involved in active resistance. And one of the things that I learnt from Gustavo was how to give up, because he would always tell the story of the three turnings of his life. When he was very young, he'd been kind of caught up in the epic of development in the first wave of the American multinationals arriving in Mexico, full of promises. And he said, I was swept up in that and I believed everything they were saying. And he said, but by the time I was 22, I could see clearly that the bright future for everyone that was being promised wasn't the truth of what this was bringing, that this was really bringing, stuff to benefit the bosses at the expense of the workers. And so at 22, he walked away from what looked like this very successful career. He was like the youngest executive at IBM. And then he went off and joined this Marxist guerrilla group. And for the next few years, he threw his life into that. But then he said, what happened was that one of the leaders in this group that he was part of shot one of the others in a fight over somebody's girlfriend. And he said, and it was a revelation to me of the violence that we wanted to unleash on society as a whole. And even though I still held with a great deal of the political analysis that we'd been operating from, I couldn't be part of that. And so then he kind of went into the institutions and worked for a good number of years within the civil service, and rose to a very senior position. And as I understand it, in 1976, there was an incoming government, this kind of president who was coming from a kind of left populist place, who knew Gustavo well and offered him a position in his cabinet. And Gustavo turned it down and walked away. And the way he used to tell this story, it was really clear that when he said no to that, he couldn't explain even to himself, let alone to his peers, why he was saying no. He said, I just knew from my experience that even with the best people in the room, the view from up there in government and what people see on the ground is irreconcilable. There is a gap. And he said, I didn't understand it fully, but I knew that I had to go there, walk away from that center of power. And so that's what took him into the barrios, into the work that he would have been doing at the point where you guys crossed paths. And what I learnt from that, and firstly, I identified with the experience of having to say no and walk away without being able to explain clearly why. Because that was my experience when I was in my mid-20s leaving the BBC. That was the experience that Paul Kingsnorth and I shared when we started Dark Mountain. And actually, Gustavo was one of the very few people who Paul and I knew in common when we first met. Paul's first book, One No, Many Yeses, that title comes from a slogan that Gustavo came up with. And Paul interviewed Gustavo in the early part of that book. So again and again in my life, I've met people and we've discovered that Gustavo was the person we had in common. It was the same when I met Vanessa Andreotti for the first time. But what I understood from interviewing Gustavo about that third turning of his life was sometimes you can't explain why you need to give up on something, because from where you are before you've given up, you can't see what you can't see. And it's only by giving up and being prepared to walk away and put yourself somewhere else, somewhere that looks weak, somewhere that looks a long way away from the centres of power, that you can catch sight of what it wasn't possible to see from the room that you were sitting in when you made that decision. And so you almost have to make a sort of Kierkegaardian leap of faith in order, and I talk about this in At Work in the Ruins. I say, giving up is always giving up on something, though it may feel at the time like giving up on everything, because you only get to find out what's left once you've made that move, once you've taken that risk without a guarantee, without a promise, and walked away. And Gustavo was the person who embodied that for me and who brought that into focus for me, both within his experience and my own, and then recognizing it in the experience of other people who I learned from over the years. So that's one of the things that I owe to him.
Can I follow from that? As I was listening to you, I was evoking moments of rupture in my life. Like when I was chairman of this Department of Anthropology and Sociology, this private university, I was appointed a dean, Basilio Rojas, and I went to him and said, I don't want you to be my boss, I resign. He said, give us some time. And then John Chance, an ethnohistorian, married to Zapoteca, and Gustavo's, the mother's side, had Zapoteca, and Zapoteca culture and people are very powerful historically. They were the ones that kicked the French, Maximilian, when Bonaparte wanted to have Mexico. So another time that I felt my former father-in-law, I say, I mean it, may he not rest in peace, wherever he is, he offered me employment at the so-called Tribunal de Contas. It's the overseer of the budget of the state of Rio. And they were paid for life a salary over the salary of an ambassador in Brazil, which is, I don't know how many thousands of dollars, to be honest. It's a colonial institution. Lula has not dealt with it. I doubt he will. At the time, this guy had 20 people in his private staff in this tribunal. They're called ministers. His sisters, his daughters, former son-in-law, and Azril that said no. So then it's the inspiration of integrity that Gustavo and Illich also. And something in our style that sometimes is provocative. Like you even can come to enjoy being provocative, too provocative. So I wanted to mention a nuance between Ivan and Gustavo vis-a-vis Freire, because the framework here had to be with Freire. First, Freire did understand the importance of hope, and he wrote about the pedagogy of hope. And I think that's a plus. And in Gustavo, there's also the message of hope. Now, Ivan and Paul disagreed radically about schools. So Ivan Illich wrote The School in Society, saying private, public schools reproduce the system of exploitation and oppression. And Freire said, still is a trench to be fought, to be struggled. But they wrote a book together about this difference. I think Gustavo was more like this, boom. And then, while he knew Freire, then he criticizes him on grounds that I could actually question, because it is true that some people made Freire, even today, like a guru, like a mantra. And then we don't like gurus, this kind of mantras. But I have met people in unusual circumstances, people that had been in jail in the United Kingdom, that had been with IRA, and they found pedagogy of the oppressed that was inspired by Marx and Frantz Fanon also. And in jail, this book gave them hope to come out. And I saw the book they wrote. If not, I would say maybe it was just blah, blah, blah. I met a Palestinian psychoanalyst in Ramallah that found Freire, and that book gave them hope to endure prison. So I still will link the focus of this meeting with Freire and Gustavo Esteva, saying that, and then I have a line that has to do with our affective part, our emotions. Many times we disengage emotion, disenchanted. Like Gustavo got disenchanted with Marxism, and then because, it's very categorical, mechanistic, when it's not dialectic. And then he went through postmodernism, that was an answer to this kind of mechanicism. But he was critical of Western postmodernism because it was lost in diversity, and it was not, in a way, saying what is common in the diversity, in the plurality. So, and this is quite important, because it's not enough to take in the diversity. You need to weave again a collective answer that is not vertical to counteract things like the cultural warfare going on today, that, the far right and climate negativism on there. So you mentioned the term process, and I like that. And Freire was very keen on saying, I'm not, I'm becoming, and we are becoming. And I think Gustavo is a good example of becoming, because as he had a rupture, then there was a new horizon, and he was willing to stop the door and go, like he was director of a journal, El Dia, who was part of the system. Jose Portillo, in Mexico they call him the dog, because he would say, I will defend the peso like a dog, and he didn't, and then they called him the dog, okay? El perro. So he was not pretending to be progressive. He had been Minister of Finances, and they are the ones responsible for neoliberalizing Mexico, okay? So, but he was invited to work, for example, in this Sistema Mexicano de Alimentos, de Alimentación, the system of food security with FAO. And then that's when he departed from PRI, that had been running Mexico for decades, corrupt. Vargas, you also call it the perfect dictatorship or democratura, combining democracy with dictatorship, with totalitarianism.
And we have a mission, almost like a curse and a mission in this podcast also, to try to take the conversations, the thinking, the inspiration, all of it, into something also practical, or something that can be transformed to something into the here and now, and not the felt or imagined or real impossibilities, but rather like what are things we can actually influence and actually things we can do. And I think you and Ed Gillespie in your podcast, The Great Humbling, you talked about populism, and you talked about the work that you do, Dougald, near to home and the people where you live.
Sure.
And the connections. But that was just at the end of the podcast, and then I was like, I'm missing 5 minutes, or I'm missing 10 minutes. This could be something extended around there, because that also connects to Gustavo Esteva when he kind of found himself, as we speak about, and he found his work with the peasants, with the local, moving back.
I was going to say, let's see if we can weave something together with that. So, another piece of Gustavo's story, and again, like you will know parts of this that you experienced at first hand that I only know by hearing the story told. But anyone who's read that book by Rebecca Solnit about, what's it called, the strange utopias that happen in the aftermath of disasters.
A Paradise Built in Hell.
Paradise Built in Hell, thank you. She tells the story of these movements in Mexico City in the era when you and Gustavo met, where he was part of these networks from the late 70s onwards in the barrios, with these kind of landless peasants arriving in the poorest areas of Mexico City. One of the really concrete practical things they were working with was compost toilets. And the government and the city authorities were trying to make this illegal, because they're like, we want to become a developed society. In a developed society, you shit into water, mix it with piss, send it all away, because there's this place called away, which is always somebody else's here. And so up until this earthquake hit in 1985, the work that they were doing around the compost toilets was antagonizing and being threatened by the authorities. Then suddenly you have this massive earthquake. Half of a city of 20 million people has lost its sewerage system. And the thing that yesterday was regarded as primitive, old-fashioned, we need to get rid of this, is the only thing left that works. And that, to me, is a paradigm for a lot of practical work, and has been throughout my life. A lot of the work that I've been involved in is underwritten by the thought, what's worth practicing today that might be the only thing that works tomorrow. So, when I was living in London, and we created this thing called the West Norwood Feast, this community-owned and run street market. And I have this lovely photo of this group of people stood at really early on a Sunday morning in fluorescent jackets on the steps of a church in the middle of this very ordinary area of South London called West Norwood, and they're waiting for a guy to turn up with a van full of market stalls that they're going to set up for this community-run street market. And this is not some kind of anarchist, money-free utopia. It's literally a street market, so there's literally money and economics involved in it. But those people are out of bed at 6 o'clock on a Sunday morning, not because anyone's paying them to be there, not because anyone has power over them and can make them be there by telling them. They're there for their own reasons. And maybe they always secretly wanted to run a street market. I don't think that's it. I think it's that the street market is the excuse for something else, which I would, for want of a better language, I'd say humans being human together. People coming together for reasons outside of the logic of the market or the state. And the reason I've given so much of my time to creating projects like that with people is because that is the only way that human communities have worked and lived and thrived for most of human history. And if things turn out less badly than we often fear they're going to in the times ahead, it's because we relearn the capacity or revalue the capacity that has been marginalized and trivialized within our developed societies for coming together like that to make things work. And part of what's powerful about that for me is that I get tired sometimes of spending so much of my life in rooms where, here in Sweden where we live, I can look around the room and I can go, I'm pretty sure nearly everybody in this room voted for the same political party at the last general election, and that political party got 4% of the vote. And it's useful to spend time within our activist ghettos or whatever, but I don't want to get too comfortable with that, because I also live in a place which has a population of about 1,500, and lots of my neighbours voted for very different parties. I don't want to know what parties some of my neighbours voted for, because we still live alongside each other and we need to find ways of making life work together. And I get more excited actually about, the work that I'm doing where Anna and I have got involved with this local music and dance venue. It's a kind of Folkets Park on the edge of Östervåla that's been going it'll be marking its 90th anniversary next year. And for all that time, it's been run by volunteers. And for a while in the 60s and 70s, when the biggest acts in the world came on tour to Sweden, they played 3 places. They played at the amusement park in Gothenburg, the amusement park in Stockholm, and at Skogsvallen in Östervåla, population 1,500. So Simon and Garfunkel, Chuck Berry, Miriam Makeba, Status Quo, all of these greats of so many different genres have played in what's now my little hometown. And I am so excited by, getting in a room alongside a guy who ran a gas station for 30 years and a carpenter and manager from the local supermarket and nurse, all of whom live, within walking distance of where I live, and us figuring out together how we create the next chapter in the history of this place that has mattered to a lot of people. Both because in the moment, in the present tense, it's a beautiful thing to be part of, and also because it is part of that work of regenerating people's space that Gustavo spoke about. It's part of the work of recovering our capacity for being human together, dealing with what we need to deal with in the places where we are, rather than waiting for the powerful forces of the market or the state to come in and either solve things or make things worse. And I know that we're going to need more of that capacity. Like, when the shit hits the fan, I don't want to only know the people who show up to the Transition Towns meeting, because with no offence to my friends within Transition Towns, we don't have all of the capacity and all of the skill and all of the perspectives that are going to be needed. And actually, when I look around the room at our Skogsvallen committee meeting, I think between us, we would do a better job of covering all of the perspectives and being able to bring in all of the voices and skills within our community when times get hard, as I'm sure they're going to. So, to me, there is a continuity from what I learned from Gustavo to what I'm learning, getting involved in whatever the next chapter of the sort of folkrörelse within the Swedish context is in the place where I've ended up settling and making a home. And I remember writing to Gustavo in about 2015, and apologizing to him because I hadn't seen him in years, and I hadn't come to the last couple of things that he'd come over to Europe for that I'd been invited to. And I said, I find myself traveling less and less than I used to, and being more focused on just being in the country where I am and the place where I am. And he said, don't apologize. Like, when people like you, when people who come from where you were born start to stay home and get involved in what's needed where you are, like, we might be getting on the right track. And it was a kind of reiteration of that message from Illich, the to hell with good intentions thing. And that mattered a lot to me. That felt like a kind of a blessing on having entered a different season in my life, when I was no longer out kind of making these journeys to far off places to learn from Gustavo and others from that network, and was just trying to apply the things I'd learned closer to home.
Great. Listening to you bring images to me like this about not helping the poor people. It's a tale by Tolstoy, where the slave tells the patron, okay, you want to help me get off my shoulders?
Yeah.
so that's one image that came to me. And then I was thinking about Gandhi, because Gustavo took the non-violent way, and Gandhi was the first thing they show you when you go to Gandhi's ashrams. I was in Sevagram. They go to show you the toilet. That was the first thing, come there. So there might have been a connection there. And maybe Ashish Kothari will know about that connection. As a person, as me, I would say Gustavo was bloody right, that if people like you are doing what you're doing, that makes all the sense in the world. Because in my case, I have kind of a community in the world. But like my children, grandchildren are in the States or in Brazil, far away from me. But, there will be a Peruvian community waiting for me and so on, but not where I live. And I had thought about transition towns, and I know at some place in Sweden works, in other places doesn't. In Uppsala, for X reasons, that we could be part of the problem as well. Because I like the idea of transition towns, but it has to be rooted the way you are rooted in community. We have conversed about this Yes magazine. And the former editor is a very dear friend, Sarah Van Gelder, and she wrote a book, The Revolution Where You Live. It's like, that's that's where I live. Then we have an activist group confronting Uppsala Hem, because Uppsala Hem, even though it's a municipal company, is worse than the market, so we have Fridays for the Future. Then it's part of my Friday community where we try. SEMOS at one time was very important as a platform for the Uppsala Social Forum, because we needed a platform, and SEMOS kindly offered that. And then we were able to actually link most of the movements in Uppsala, peace movement, everything. And this is, again, needed today. Today we are fragmented in different things. So while the need is there, then you will need a concerted effort to make that meeting place again. But it will need to be inspired and fed by your kind of existential you mentioned Kierkegaard, the leap of faith, something like this in place. So in a way, it's how to weave both. And one thing that came yesterday, and also from the meeting that was by the political ecology of the far right a month or 2 months ago, that we might need, as kind of a reflection for this meeting as well, a kind of think tank to be able to read the context and be able to respond with positive examples and not just good intentions.
Yes.
But that could also be said to be a community. I mean, think tank works for me, and we had an old idea of a think and feel tank to make it a bit more quirky, but then again, gathering in community and also welcoming all sorts of people does not, our headlines and the framings I put on things sometimes is not always the big open door you want.
We need different languages, we need different communities. I remember my dad saying this to me, that he realized when he was quite young, and my dad spent his working life from the age of 30 onwards as a minister in the United Reformed Church. So I grew up around churches, and community is a big part of that. And I remember him saying that he realized when he was quite young that community is a good thing. It's best to have more than one. It's best to belong within more than one community, because if you only have one community you belong to, then you're very vulnerable. And when there is a tension between your belonging within community and your expression of the truth of you and of what you're able to see, then it's a lonely position to be in. And so in multiple ways, both, I think we need both and Gustavo was always very clear about this, that we need both our local belonging and our connectedness over distance. We need different languages according to what context we're in as well. So, the Transition Towns group is a good thing. I'm a big fan of transition towns. It's just if we get stuck in thinking that or anything else is the only type of context in which the work needs to be done, or in which we need to gather. And I'm thinking about, what you're speaking about in terms of the far right. I'm thinking about something that Tim Morton said in this session that we did together yesterday. He said, we cede far too much ground to the far right. And he was talking actually quite specifically from his own position in an American context, saying we cede the ground of theology, we cede the ground of faith, we cede the ground of God to the far right. And that's a mistake. And that to me is just one example. We cede the past, we cede tradition to the far right. We let them claim to be the representatives of tradition. One of the things that I loved about Gustavo was he would always say, in Mexico, we have a great tradition of changing our traditions traditionally. I quote Gustavo so often in different contexts. That's one of those lines of his. He was so quotable. And, and part of why I keep coming back to that one is because it's the nail in the coffin of modernity's imagined other, of timeless tradition. Modernity on the one hand consists of this addiction to the new. I always say, my definition of modernity is it is that window in time and place when it seemed natural to treat our proximity to the future as our defining feature, the best and most important thing about us. And as that began to feel absurd or problematic, then this talk of postmodernism of various flavours crept in, because the future ceased to be a vehicle of hope and became a source of anxiety from the 70s onwards in more and more contexts. But, on the one hand, modernity was addicted to the future and the new, and on the other hand, it imagined this other thing called timeless tradition, which is very bound up with the way in which modernity imagined everybody else to be living in a state of nature. European philosophers spent 200 years having these big debates about the state of nature. And I know that, Graeber and Wengrow have, made an important point about how far that was actually inflected by things that were being imported from encounters with indigenous thinking in North America. And there's truth in that. But nonetheless, that entire framing, that entire debate missed the obvious point, which is that what our ancestors encountered when they crossed the Atlantic was not people who were living in a state of nature, but people who were living in a state of culture. People who were living in other cultures, other histories, that we were so, arrogant and ignorant that we didn't even know how to learn from. And very, very belatedly, late in the day, there is now a widening awareness, at least in the circles that we spend our time in, of the need to listen to what people have been trying to tell us for 500 years from the other end of those encounters. And Gustavo, for me, was one of the people I got to know, well enough that I was really able to hear and learn from his stories as an ambassador for someone who could speak from that 500 years of experience. And, and all the cost of that. He would say when he was a child, his mother was indigenous and his father was a white Mexican, and his mother wouldn't let her own mother enter the house through the front door or speak her native language to her grandchildren. And he said, because my mother genuinely felt that the best thing that she could do for her children was to spare us the stigma of indigeneity.
Yeah, sure.
The most influential anthropological school of modernization, using Marxist language, was you need to transform the peasant into a proletarian to make the proletarian revolution.
Yes.
Manuel Aguirre Beltran. That was the main line. So there was Marxist modernization, kind of. I'm just doing free association. There was a socialist motto, which was barbarism or socialism. So today we have techno-barbarism. Socialism doesn't sound so good, so much so that the far right is no longer National Socialists, but they are National Democrats or Swedish Democrats. So would we be able to frame in terms of hope, like techno-barbarism or communitarianism, or because something that is a crisis today is the lack of community. People are uprooted, alienated, fragmented, and then they are very susceptible, vulnerable to mass manipulation, which is happening now.
Yes.
So, as a way to counteract this techno-barbarism, rebuilding of community, of social cement, something of that nature then.
And I'm thinking what we kind of done now, and the other things I'm working on, and one of the other things I'm working on at SIMS is what we call course development, and that sounds very boring, but it's basically coming up with new courses, remixing the old ones, thinking about what is missing at the university, what are students also interested in, what does the planet and the world need, in a sense, from educated people. But it's kind of like making community together, but it's not like we're coming from this educated pedestal down and making the community. It's rather we're making it together in the local context, in a sense. But it's also, and that goes back to your work now, is also, I get just the sense, and I can't really place a rational thought thread on it, but it's like, it's also about coming home.
Yes, it's about coming
home.
When
everything breaks down, or not everything, things are breaking down, you have a stronger need to come home.
And be brought down to earth as well, like Bayo Komolafe says, we're coming down to earth, we'll not all arrive intact. And then the hope is that we can be broken in ways that have a chance of healing. But part of that being brought down to earth and being broken is the gap between the kinds of knowledge that have been privileged and celebrated and the kinds of ignorance that have been hidden, kinds of knowledge that have been hidden. I've found myself lately all over the place retelling this story from John Moriarty, the Irish philosopher, who was of a similar generation to Gustavo, and I think Gustavo would have liked this story. Moriarty grew up in rural Ireland in the 1930s, I guess it would have been. And he said, in the world where I grew up, if one morning we'd woken up and everyone over the age of 14 had disappeared, those of us who were left, the 14-year-olds and younger, could have run the farms, could have run the villages. We had the skills to feed ourselves and our community and meet each other's needs. And from the viewpoint of the university system that Moriarty then goes off into in his early adult life as a philosopher, from the viewpoint of that system, this was a world characterized by ignorance. What I see now is we're at the far end of the arc of that journey that Moriarty was such a prophet of, because I see people with PhDs being willing to roll around in the cow shit in the byre and be confronted with their own ignorance, with how helpless their highly valued, expensive education has left them for the practical skills that everyone in the world Moriarty grew up in needed. And that makes me think of Berger as well, because Berger tells this story when he was this celebrated Marxist intellectual about the age that I am now, and he goes to settle in this village in the Haute-Savoie with the sort of last generation of peasants in Western Europe. And he says, how I became accepted for all that I would always be different, how I became accepted by my neighbors, was my willingness to make a fool of myself by helping out when I was far more clueless than they were, but I was willing to get dirty and put in the work. And I feel like, the great untold story of the moment we're in is that so much of the knowledge about the trouble the world is in, including but not limited to climate change, is produced by, held by, and spoken about by people who are also fundamentally helpless, because our educations have left us so ill-equipped for the most important practical things that we rely on other people who we never meet to do. And in a sense, that helplessness gets bundled up with what we know about and the good grounds we have to fear about things like climate change. And meanwhile, some of the people who are doing the practical work and have the practical skills are so alienated by the contempt that this system shows for their kinds of knowledge and skill that they aren't even prepared to listen to what the science is saying. And they'll say, I don't even believe in climate change. But they're nonetheless often holding the practical skills that actually give us the kinds of next steps that are going to be needed. I just read an amazing book by M.R. O'Connor called Ignition, Lighting Fires in a Burning World, about her experiences of training as a wildland firefighter and controlled burn setter across the US. And lots of the people she's working with, some of them are pretty right-wing. Some of them would say they don't believe in climate change. Most of them know how to wield a chainsaw, which maybe none of us sitting around this table knows how to do. But what you see in the process of that book is somebody being transformed by her experience of that work from a position of paralysis and helplessness in the face of climate change to beginning to have a glimpse of the strange alliances between indigenous people, working class people, lots of people whose knowledge and skills are not valued, working alongside scientists who've often been marginalized within their own fields because they're seen as heretical for the things they've been advocating, to arrive at a vision of what those landscapes in North America need in order to thrive, even in the harsher times that climate change is bringing. So those are the kind of clues and threads that I find myself pulling on and following now.
Well, thinking about artificial intelligence, how that fits in. And this a line from Karl Mannheim when he wrote about ideology and utopia. He said, all innovations against what modernity would preach are bound to increase the control of the few over the many. And this is extremely the case now. We are entering this new territory where less and less people, including myself, because I guess I'm trying to have my aloe plant survive in my kitchen, but it's a gap in terms of, as you said, people could understand the technology, the pre-modern technology, they could how it works, and then they could manage. And today, it's further and further. So it's a state of extreme alienation, estrangement from nature. Monsanto wants to make soil redundant because you could have hydroponic potatoes, used by McDonald's and so on. So how do we confront this kind of techno-barbarism now made worse by artificial intelligence? How do we put community into that landscape? That would be...
That's it's the perfect big size ending question.
Yeah.
Because we have run out of time, but this is, please.
So I have a feeling that if Gustavo was sitting with us, one of the things he might say is he might talk about Karl Polanyi and the double movement and say, yes, that trajectory that you're describing, that is going on. But there is also a counter movement happening at the same time, because it was Gustavo who first got me to see how significant the double movement in Polanyi's description of what was happening in the 19th century could be to our understanding of where we find ourselves now. Because what it does is it doesn't ask you to deny the power of the top-down kind of power project that gets most of the airtime in the story about what's happening in the world. But what Polanyi says is, laissez-faire was planned, the response to it wasn't. So in the 19th century, you had this first era of free market globalization that had this rhetoric of free laissez-faire, but there was actually a top-down power project from above, by the equivalent of the kind of Davos set of its day. And meanwhile, the response wasn't what Marxism often wants to describe it as being, having a kind of coherence emerging from a unified class consciousness with a single political subject of the proletariat. Actually, it was improvised from below, from different directions, from people who didn't necessarily agree with each other or work that closely with each other, but who were responding to the consequences on the ground of the destruction being brought by the laissez-faire project. And out of that gradually emerged, the better side of what was achieved for a while within Western modernity in terms of the social democratic projects of the 20th century, the trade unions, absolutely. And so in the same sense, I don't give a lot of time and thought to artificial intelligence, except to be looking for, what are the things that are invisible to the lenses through which the people who are all hyped up about that are looking at the world? What's missing from their grasp of reality that gives us some clues to where the pockets are? The shape of a pocket was a phrase that Berger got from Marcos, from the Zapatistas. He said, the shape of hope today is the shape of a pocket, an air pocket, a pocket of resistance. The pockets are partly the places that are just missing from the maps of power, and that therefore are, they don't look big enough to be taken seriously. And therefore there's a chance of doing things within them that might still work when the power projects are brought down by their own internal contradictions. And, it may be naive of me to believe that that's the case, but that still is the kind of strange hope that I cling to, that what's worth doing today is not trying to bring down the system, but trying to build the things that will still work when the system brings itself brings itself down, or maybe the metaphor is more like a machine that's being run faster and faster, so it's both intensifying and bits are flying off it at the same time. And I think that's the kind of moment that we're in, and therefore like building the capacity for the thing that still works the day after the earthquake is kind of the model for the types of action, the types of practice that I want to be part of.
Can we continue?
We should wrap up, but if you have a comment.
John Haraway says that today they excluded from this machine can take the far right or the left. And what he's observing is that with this so-called neoliberal stage, which creates more inequality, the excluded are moving more to the far right. This is like an observation he makes. But yeah, we need to wrap up.
Yes, we need to wrap up.
Well, this is to be continued another time, isn't it?
Yes, and put into practice.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like always. We want to show the book again. I think I can cut that into the camera, because this is about what you just spoke about.
Yeah.
How to make good runes, right?
Yeah.
Work in the ruins.
Yeah. And also, you're coming back to Siemens March 11th.
I am.
And that's also an open lecture.
Yeah.
With a long title that I don't remember at the moment.
Me neither.
You probably sent it before the end of last year. It's on Siemens' webpage. And then we are back March 21st, as I mentioned in the beginning, for World Poetry Day and a Poetry Circle, which we did last year as well. And I haven't told you yet, Azril, but I found this amazing poem by Freddy Fonseca, who was part of that session in January last year.
Yes, I have
called Antarctica, and he has a dance piece to that. So all of that is also on Siemens' webpage.
And Mike Judge, who was there, he has his own web, and he's doing incredibly good work.
Yeah. So we're racing through guests, and we're forgetting somebody I remember. And then we have his book as well, Freddy Fonseca's book. So that's good. Dougald, anything on your side? You're all sorts of social media, Substack, and those things. But
yeah, I mean, Substack is the best place for people who want to kind of both read back into the things that I've been doing and get news of what's coming next. Yeah. So that's just dougald.substack.com. Yeah.
And is there any events or happenings on the horizon?
I'm sure there are. There will be a new series with a school called Home coming later this spring. We haven't launched that yet. There is going to be a series of Sunday evening sessions on Zoom starting on March the 10th, when I'll be in conversation with the artist and writer Caroline Ross. And that will be running now ongoingly. I'm going to be speaking at the European Eco Village gathering in Värmland in August, giving a keynote there. I think that's all I can remember off the top of my head.
Substack.
Yes.
So thank you, Dougald. Thank you, Azril. Thank you for those of you listening on the other side of the screen. We didn't have time for any questions. We just rolled through this. But thank you for listening and being part of this.